Freedom is the ability to live your life as you want to live it. We think of freedom most of the time as being in relationship to the government, because the government seems to be the biggest inhibitor of our freedom, taking so much of what we earn every week, taking so much of our time consumed in dealing with regulations and rules that the government has set, taking so much control over our lives because of rules that it sets even on personal behavior, of what kind of medicines you can take, of what you can smoke and what you can drink and when you can do it and where you can do it, and all of these things. Obviously, we don't have a great deal of control over our own lives, so we think of that. But that's not the end of it. There is much more to it. We give up freedom in many ways voluntarily, to people that we know, to obligations that we make, to society in general, so-called. We also give up freedom to people we deal with in many ways that we don't really need to. And libertarians understand a great deal about the relationship of freedom with regard to the state. And you can define libertarianism in many ways. I often say, when somebody says, what's a libertarian? I say, well, a libertarian is somebody who is really serious about reducing government to its absolute minimum. In other words, somebody who doesn't say, hey, we had a great victory because government only grew by 4% this year instead of 5%. Or, gee, we stopped that new welfare bill, or whatever it is. What a great victory for freedom. No, libertarians are serious about reducing freedom to its absolute minimum, whatever that may be. But to me, all of libertarian thought, and this is, again, something where you might arrive at a different formulation, but to me, all of libertarian thought stems from one simple principle. An obvious principle, and yet with so many ramifications. The principle is that everyone thinks for himself. Now, everyone does think for himself. Now, people, everybody knows somebody who can't make a decision, so-called, who says, you know, I don't know what to do about this. Tell me, what should I do, so forth and so on. Even that person is thinking for himself. He is deciding who it is that he wants to give him advice. And he may or may not take the advice, no matter how many times he asks for it. No matter how many people he asks for advice, he may wind up doing something that nobody has suggested. Everybody thinks for himself. And from that simple premise, we move outward to the point where we realize that things that government says that it's going to do never work, because they are based on the unrealistic premise that people will stop thinking for themselves, that people will stop pursuing their own self-interest, that people will stop being individual human beings and be whatever the state wants them to be. So a law is passed governing healthcare by bureaucrats, and it assumes that doctors will no longer think for themselves, that doctors will no longer make their own decisions, that now the doctors will do whatever the bureaucrats want. But they don't. And so the whole bureaucratic healthcare system fails. And we have, in the process, destroyed what was the greatest healthcare system the world has ever known. So I wrote How I Found Freedom in an Unfree World to demonstrate that by following unrealistic premises, we give up a tremendous amount of freedom of our own free will, if you can stand the irony. That on our own, without any nudge from the government whatsoever, we managed to give away a great deal of the freedom that we could have. And so I built the book around 3 sections. The second section, if I may begin there, provides specific techniques for freeing yourself from government to a certain extent, on your own, without any help from the collective, from the Libertarian Party, from anybody else, but just simply doing things that you have control over to make yourself freer from the government, or from society, or from bad relationships of one kind or another, to satisfy obligations quickly so you can move on to a freer life, things of this sort. And the third part is making enormous changes in your life. Getting out of a bad marriage, getting out of a bad business relationship, getting out of something that you have thought was impossible to get out of and yet you knew was not right for you. Providing whatever techniques I could to help you do this particular thing. But now let's go back to the first part. The first part is a series of traps. And I defined a trap as being something that has three elements. First of all, it is an assumption that is widely held by people. Secondly, it is not true. At least it should. I think it's not true if you examine it very closely. And third, it inhibits your freedom. By accepting this premise, this trap, you are giving up a great deal of your freedom. The most basic trap of all is what I call the identity trap, and that is the belief that you should be something other than what you are, that you must be the kind of person that other people expect of you, that you must live up to an ideal that somebody else states. And this can be in big ways, going into the business that your family has set out for you, or it can be in small ways, being in a conversation out here in the foyer and saying what you think people expect you to say rather than what you really believe. I mean, there are huge, huge violations of the identity trap, and there are very trivial ones. But they are the most common kind of trap, and they're at the root pretty much of all the others. But there are others, like the morality trap, and that is believing that you must abide by a code of conduct that has been determined by somebody else rather than you, and which may not fit your nature at all. There are the government traps, a group of them, among which are the belief that government performs some useful function that you must support. And it's very hard for libertarians to accept the idea of that one. But secondly, the belief that governments can keep you from being free, that because government has this great power, you don't have any power at all, which is not true. A very important trap is the despair trap, as I call it, which is the belief that other people can prevent you from being free, that you can't be free because other people won't let you be free. There's the utopia trap, the idea that you can't be free until society is free, and therefore you have to change society, and that's more important than changing yourself, or not changing yourself, but your relationship to the world and the things that you do. And all of this, there are other traps as well, but they all revolve around these three basic elements, and that is that they are widely held beliefs that on closer examination will not stand up and in some way or other inhibit your own freedom of action, so that you are not living the kind of life that you can imagine would be better for you. Now, I begin the book with three basic premises in discussing the identity trap. The first is the realization that every individual, by nature, by virtue of being a human being, is pursuing happiness. And what do I mean by happiness? Well, happiness can be defined almost any way that you choose to do so, and you can reach a whole lot of conclusions depending on the way you define it. But really, happiness, I think, is very simple. It is the feeling of well-being, a mental feeling that we get. Now, happiness can come from watching a good movie, happiness can come from making love, happiness can come from reading a good book or listening to good music, happiness can come from doing good works, happiness can come from making $1 million, happiness can come from all different kinds of things. But what they all have in common is that they all give the person who has done this particular thing the feeling of well-being, as opposed to a feeling of discomfort or anxiety or unfulfilledness or whatever it may be. The second premise is that every individual is different, that what will provide happiness for one person will not necessarily provide happiness for another. And of course, this is a very important realization concerning the identity trap. It is why it is the falling into the identity trap that gets your mother to say, if you just live this way, you will be happy. Take it from me, this is what I did. And it worked out perfectly. I'm happy, you don't see me unhappy, so forth and so on. So why can't you do this and be happy too? Because I'm not you, mother. And fortunately, I didn't have a mother like that, but I've seen enough movies about Jewish mothers to know how common it is. But you get the point. The third premise is, and this, I may not have the best terminology in the world, so forgive me if there's a little bit of ambiguity in it, and that is, you control only yourself. Now, by that I mean that really what it comes down to is you cannot think and make decisions for other people. You can only hope to influence other people by creating alternatives that you hope will lead them to choose one thing over another. Now, the alternatives that you create may be sticking a gun in the person's ribs, but he still will decide whether he wants to risk death or obey you or whatever. Or the alternatives that you may create will be offering him money or being a good person, helping that person, whatever it may be. But the point is that he will still make the final decisions. And the irony is that if you think you're going to control others, you wind up being controlled by them. That when you decide that you must control your son, for example, or your business partner, or somebody else, you give up control to that extent over your own life. Because now you must pay attention to everything that person does. Now you must follow that person around and stop him every time he's going to do the wrong thing. Now you must react every time he acts. You must respond in some way, and you are no longer initiating the action in your life. You are now a passive person who is responding to what that person is activating from one thing to the next. And so you have in the process given up control over your own life by trying to control others. Now, in the limited time we have available, I thought what I might do is to run through one trap, just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. And the trap I will take, on the one hand, may seem so trivial that it might seem to trivialize the book, but on the other hand, it may, to you personally, be so controversial that you think, well, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. So either way, I'm probably going to lose, but one way or another, let's take the unselfishness trap as the example of a trap. The unselfishness trap is the belief that you should put others' interests ahead of your own, that you must live for the benefit of others, and that you should not think of yourself first. And it's a very common belief. It's common to many religions. It is common to many philosophies. It is so common that people never bother to justify it. Nobody ever says, well, here's why you should put others first. They just say, you can't do that. You have to think of others before yourself. Or it comes to you in the form of, why are you thinking of yourself? Is this all about you? Why do we have to do what you want? Why can't you ever do what other people want? Well, unselfishness is based on a very realistic concept. It overlooks the most important and basic factor having to do with it. Assuming that unselfishness were even possible, and I hope to show in a moment that it isn't, but assuming that it were possible, unselfishness could only achieve a purpose if there were some selfish person around to receive the benefits that the unselfish person is going to bestow. Let's just imagine that happiness were a big red rubber ball. And I happen to possess that big red rubber ball. But of course, I don't want to be selfish and hold this to myself, so I hand it to this gentleman here, and I give up the happiness so that he can have it. But he doesn't want to be selfish either. He's an elevated moral human being, so he hands it to the gentleman next to him, who hands it to the woman behind him, who hands it to Sharon Harris, who hands it to the gentleman behind him. And it goes around the room, and eventually it comes back to me again. And what in the world has been accomplished by all of this? Once again, it serves no purpose whatsoever unless there is a selfish person somewhere at the end of the line who's going to get this and say, hey, thank you, this is exactly what I wanted. And I feel no guilt whatsoever about keeping it.